Other than that, I think it's about time to start talking about EECOM and give away our first teacher award. If I could invite Ryan up here.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Can you see me and hear me okay? Great. Let me get all queued up here. What about now? Another successful screen share from across the country?
Woohoo!
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Benson, and I am EECOM, the most northern and western member, though that map was very cool. I'm not the most northern or western member of this conference. Hello, Eastern Canada, Central Canada, and Nunavut as well, I saw. That's awesome. I work for the Department of Environment and have taken over on the EECOM board from my predecessor, who was one of the founding members and a member of the board for 30 years. So EECOM, go to eecom.org and add it to your list of extensive bookmarks that you're going to get from this conference. But as Zomi said, we're a national bilingual and charitable network, and we strive to promote environmental literacy and stewardship through action. Part of that is honoring the legacy of those that came before us, people like Remy Rodden, who was my predecessor, and part of it is being a bit of a hub like we are trying to be now across this big sea to sea to sea country and bring people together for really fun things like that. Because we started in 1995, we've been celebrating outstanding contributions to the field of environmental education and communication for decades now. Our somewhat grassroots beginning in the environmental movement have led us all collectively, here we are, to this huge community across Canada. And it's an honor and a lot of fun to present 8 awards annually to deserving individuals and organizations. I get to do 2 of those, and you'll meet some more board members throughout the conference as we roll through the other 8. We weigh all of these nominees to determine the winners based on 5 categories. So we have commitment to the advancement of environmental education and communication, impact as a tangible and potentially long-lasting agent of change, collaboration through work with individuals, organizations, and communities, mentorship through fostering understanding, ethics, skills, and actions in others, and innovation by displaying courage and originality in the design and development of environmental education and communication resources. Like I said, go to eecom.org and add that to your list of bookmarks. I should also mention that I'm on the lands of the Kwamlin Dun and Tonquichan Council that's 2 of the 14 First Nations that we have up here in the Yukon, and they are celebrating their 50th anniversary of an amazing guiding document called Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow that you might have seen in the national news. So people are very fired up about the legacy of that, which includes the founding of a First Nations school board, which is pretty cutting edge and about 50 years in the making. We just got that done last year. So lots of exciting things happening up in the Yukon. I see Jordan shaking her head. Is that a me? No. You're going to see some banners in a few minutes as I go through here, and these are local things, but our award-winning banner is from Mount Carlton, you guessed it, Mount Carlton Provincial Park, the highest peak in New Brunswick. Some of you local Maritimers would know this, but for the rest of us, it was pretty cool to see. Thanks to New Brunswick Tourism for that photo. And without further ado, why don't I present our first award, which is our outstanding organization, which is Students on Ice. And I'm going to take a sip of coffee here, and you should all be snacking and enjoying your lunch potentially out east. This is a mouthful. Both of these awards are a mouthful because these organizations and individuals are amazing. So bear with me as I regale you with all of their amazing accomplishments. So Students on Ice was founded in 2000, and it inspires a connection and empowers leadership for a sustainable future Their mission is to foster globally minded leaders by immersing youth in transformative experiential learning environments and collaborative cross-cultural journeys. Every year, SOI organizes one or more environmental expeditions in the Arctic or Antarctic. You might see a link pop up in the chat as we do this as well. Another bookmark to add. Pretty amazing website and amazing visuals from Students on Ice. Their core identity can be traced to these expeditions and their efforts to connect people to nature. In recent years, Students on Ice has evolved to include numerous programs that amplify their impact on youth and the polar regions. Hands-on experience, diversity, and collaboration are critical to the environmental education and communication work Students on Ice does. SOI, for short, their immersive journeys to the polar regions give youth the knowledge and leadership skills they need to address the most urgent issues of our time. Guided by a team of scientists, elders, educators, visionary leaders, participants engage in intergenerational learning about the Arctic and Antarctic. Together, they learn from one another while developing a deeper understanding of these important regions, their histories and complexities, and foster commitment to climate action, building healthy communities, and environmental stewardship. Students on Ice has led over 40 expeditions to the Antarctic, Arctic, and places in between. They're recognized as a global leader in environmental education and communication and youth engagement. Students on Ice reaches and impacts youth beyond those who participate in these life-changing expeditions through their multimedia content, conferences, events, presentations, and workshop. You should check these things out. Students on Ice digital and outreach initiatives connect, get this, more than 250 million people every year in the knowledge, experiences, and impacts that their youth gain on expeditions. Students on Ice believes in providing opportunities to a diverse group of deserving youth. This means doing what they can to remove financial barriers. Most expedition participants are now fully funded. They're very excited about that. Students on Ice bring youth from around the world together, including many Indigenous youth. While traveling in the Arctic, many Inuit youth and staff help engage participants in learning about their homeland, providing unique perspectives on Indigenous knowledge. Youth from 52 countries and 450 communities across Canada, including alumni from every community across Inuit Nunavut, have participated in Students on Ice expeditions. Students on Ice programs are transformational because they harness the power of connections, changing hearts and minds, and driving their participants to build a better tomorrow. Not only that, they're obviously also in some of the most beautiful places and fast-changing places in the world. These expeditions are eye-opening, and they are the first step in a lifelong journey of growth and empowerment. As soon as participants step away from their expedition cohort, the Students on Ice alumni program welcomes them with support to translate inspiration into action, what we're doing here. Today, Students on Ice offers 10 post-expedition programs to engage alumni in leadership development and building their professional capacity. It's for these reasons we congratulate Students on Ice as this year's recipient of EECOM's Outstanding Organization Award. Thank you to Students on Ice for your far-reaching and continued impacts to build a better future for nature and for our communities. So that's our first one of 8. And we actually have our second award recipient with us on the call today, Serge La Rochelle. Hello, nice to see you. I saw you earlier, and now I can't see you as I scroll down in the chat. I'm going to find you so I can read this to you. Give us a wave, Serge. There he is. Let me see if I can change my next slide here. Oh, what? Dun, dun, dun.
I am so excited that Serge is winning this award. I can't think of somebody who's more deserving, and also somebody who is more humble and might get overlooked for other awards because of being just such a quiet person. Geez, that's the 3rd time I've used the word humble today. I guess it's a mood.
Let me make this big so we can all celebrate him. There he is. Okay. We're glad you're here with us today. That's exciting. Serge is the program coordinator at Pédagoging Sustainable Development Group, specializing in ecological landscaping and environmental education. For many years, he's been an expert in helping local schools establish key teaching gardens using many ecological practices and linking them to curriculum. His skill with linking gardens to curriculum expands far beyond simply growing plants. In some instances, he's guided schools in harvesting, selling produce, cooking and preparing school-grown food, and linking to health, collaborating with local food producers, farmers, and markets. Local schools that don't have a garden of their own are also invited to take part in cultivation and harvest at the community garden he helps to run, recently recognized nationally as a formidable community food project by Greener Green Space, another organization to look up, for integrating community food with watershed protection, preventing coastal erosion, and encouraging native species. This massive community garden provided more than 3,000 kilograms of fresh food to Serge's community in 2022 via kitchen skills programs, food banks, and community meals. In addition to his outstanding work with school gardens, he's been an active participant in provincial and national environmental education initiatives through his career. He's a founding member of Great Minds Think Outside program, equipping educators with the skills they need to teach their students outdoors in any subject, grade, or season. He has been active in the New Brunswick's Environmental Network Sustainability Education Alliance and the Children's Environmental Health Collaborative since their beginnings. He also played an active part in the New Brunswick Regional Case of the Environment, Community and Health Observatory Project, which connects students in Kokang with counterparts in BC and help facilitate walkthrough activities in their local riparian areas using art to tell a story about watersheds and ecological footprints through photo voice, which a lot of you have likely heard of. Serge proudly upholds La Francophonie and celebrates Acadian heritage and culture in all his projects. And that's why we're celebrating Serge as an outstanding individual in an organization. Congratulations, and thank you for all of your work. That's what I have for now, but I'm happy to answer questions about EECOM. I don't want to put Serge on the spot, but if anyone has questions for him and he's willing to come out of his shell a bit, we could ask him questions about food, whatever you need as we go here. It's not even light yet here in the Yukon, and here I am fired up about this.
Well, I'm certainly honored. It was a huge surprise, and I know the depth of the work that EECOM has done. So I do have a couple of things I'd like to mention. I'd like to do it en français, if that's okay.
Of course.
J'aimerais reconnaître le support de mes collègues, du comité directeur du groupe de développement durable du pays de Cocagne, qui ont toujours encouragé les activités, que ce soit dans le jardin, dans la cuisine ou sur le bord de l'eau. Et surtout mes collègues des autres groupes environnementaux de notre région, des universités, des partenaires avec qui je travaille de longue date, qui sans eux, on ne pourrait pas faire nos activités communautaires. Bien sûr, dans les écoles, tous les enseignants, direction, personnel qui supportent nos projets, qui donnent la place chez eux pour entreprendre des projets de naturalisation, aider à faire des liens au programme, permettre de planter des arbres un peu partout. Puis, bien sûr, tous les élèves qui veulent toujours participer à leur façon, qui m'épatent tout le temps, qui m'inspirent constamment. It's really a great honor. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks, Serge. Merci. I hope to see a bunch of you in the next sessions, and I wanted to let you know that our next award for Outstanding Educator is going to be presented by Adam, who you will see. He's another member of our board, our fearless leader, and much more bilingual than me. And that'll be tomorrow between 11 and 11:10 a.m. Atlantic time. Back over to Zomi and Jordan, or if anyone else has questions about EECOM or conference doings or pro tips for navigating this amazing online system that's been set up, let us know.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Et Serge, félicitations. Je ne pourrais pas être plus content de savoir que c'est toi qui as gagné cet award au milieu. Excusez-moi pour mon français. J'ai fait mon best effort. Jordan, can I give the floor to you?
Yes. Thank you again, Ryan, for sharing those awards with us, and congratulations to SOI and Serge. for winning those awards. Now we are going to have Jaclyn Roach come up onto the stage to give us an introduction to Brave Spaces. And I will just quickly tell you a few things about Jaclyn. Jaclyn is a high school ELA teacher in Saskatchewan who is passionate about impacting her students in a positive way. Jaclyn has taught in multiple school divisions and recognizes the needs for social emotional learning in the classroom and the power it has to improve student outcomes. So I will let Jaclyn take it away with an intro to Brave Spaces. Welcome, Jaclyn.
Hi, thank you so much, Jordan. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen and hopefully we don't mess this up. But let's see. Everyone is seeing a presentation, I hope. Yes, full screen presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. That's what I want to hear. Okay, awesome. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the conference. I am so excited and honored to be here today, sharing this virtual space with you. And similar to Zomi, I feel very humbled by being asked to join you today. So thank you very much. So my name is Jaclyn Roach. I use she, her pronouns. As Jordan said, I'm a teacher in so-called Saskatchewan, and I teach grade 10 to 12 English language arts and grade 2 to 5 literacy intervention. So that's what it's like teaching in a small town when I get to teach the big kids and the little ones. I come to you, like I said, from so-called Saskatchewan. I come from Treaty 4 territory, which I've recently learned is actually one of the most decimated ecosystems in the world. And there's only about 8% of this territory that's still considered native. So I'm really grateful to people like you who are invested in and committed to seeing ecological healing in our physical spaces. So thank you for that. And I hope that you get something out of today. So my role during this introduction is, or during the opening, I should say, is to introduce all you folks to the idea of brave space and to help create a brave space, or as brave of a space as we can in this virtual space. I think it's really important to start with the question of why do we say brave space and not safe space? Typically in buildings, we see those signs in schools, office buildings, at meetings we attend that declare a space to be safe, quote unquote safe. Although I think that people who hold safe spaces or put these signs up in their space are well-intentioned, the reality is that no space is inherently safe for somebody. We all come to one another with different ideas and histories, positionalities, experiences, and different stories that impact how we show up in spaces just like this one. And because of that, there are bound to be people in those spaces that go against our systems of belief and make us feel unsafe just by being present. And this is especially true in a school setting. We know that there's no way that every student comes into a classroom, even if it has the really pretty safe space sign on the door, feeling safe with all of their peers. So instead, we choose a brave space where we might not always feel safe, but we can feel brave and we can have courage and make mistakes and disagree and believe in one another. So according to Victoria D. Stubbs, there are 6 pillars to holding a brave space. So the first pillar is vulnerability. So I could go on and on about the importance of vulnerability in our interactions with other people, in our roles as educators, learners, thinkers, friends, partners, parents, etc. But that is a whole other conversation, and I don't think I can get through it in 20 minutes. The 20 minutes that I've been given here, oopsies, that shouldn't have happened. There we go. And anyway, in terms of brave space, vulnerability means that we come to these spaces, in our case, this virtual space, There's uncertainty, and we are putting ourselves and our hearts at risk for hurt, and we are exposing ourselves emotionally. Social and ecological justice work requires heart, and brave work requires that we open our hearts and accept that we might get hurt, we might be let down, but we can do the hard things and we can be open and vulnerable anyway. We show up in our vulnerability by asking questions when we don't understand things, and sharing our story and our positionality so that our own complexities frame our comments so that other people understand where we're coming from. The second pillar that Stubbs has decided on is perspective. So again, we all come into this space with our own perspectives or lenses in which we view the world. This pillar isn't asking us to put on someone else's lenses or to look at the world through somebody else's eyes, but rather to accept that we all have different perspectives and respect that. So if we want to work within brave spaces, we must seek to understand why others think the way they do and understand why they see things differently than us. So we show up with perspective in brave spaces by listening to understand instead of listening to respond. The third pillar that comes from Stubbs' work is to lean into fear. So this idea comes from, a similar place as zone of proximal development. If we want to learn, we need to go beyond what we already know and put ourselves in situations that might make us uncomfortable. We need to be willing to take a risk in a brave space, and we need to be willing to take a risk in order to learn and to grow. So leaning into our fears in this virtual space looks like doing things that might make us nervous, reframing our mindset around fear. So rather than allowing fear to hold us back, we need to allow it to propel us forward. Stubbs's fourth pillar is critical thinking. And according to Gambrell and Gibbs, quote, critical thinking involves the careful examination and evaluation of beliefs and actions. It requires a genuine effort to critique fairly all views, preferred and unpreferred, using rigorous criteria, end quote. This means that to work within a brave space, we need to question ourselves and question one another. These questions should open conversation and allow us to have meaningful, often complex conversations. So in a brave space, critical thinking looks like being open to the possibility that we don't know everything and that our thoughts might be limited, not taking critique as a personal attack. This one is the hardest for me. As a people pleaser, I often take criticism of my ideas really personally, but it's something that I'm working on. And again, in brave space, it's about claiming humility and saying that, like, I'm not the best at everything. I don't know everything. And so, like I say, this is one area that I am struggling, and it really requires me to work hard to show up in this way. And so I think that that's part of me showing up in a brave space as well. So we need to see critique as an opportunity to grow, rather than something that is personal or should pull us down. Stubbs's fifth pillar is to examine intentions. So it's important in a brave space to consider our own impact on the conversation. Are you choosing to speak because you think that what you have to say will add to the discourse? Or are you speaking in a way that is self-serving? I think it's also important here to recognize the space we take up in these conversations and whether it really is our space to take up. The reality is that impact trumps intention every time, but we can be conscious and aware of the impact that our choices will have while focusing on our own intentions. So in brave spaces, examining your own intentions looks like asking yourself a few questions, including like, is this or is what I'm about to share moving the conversation forward? What are my reasons for my sharing or my actions? What do I hope will happen if I move forward with this? So this pillar is really about questioning ourselves and examining why and how we show up in these spaces. And the sixth and final pillar on Stubbs's list is mindfulness. I feel like mindfulness has started to become one of those words that gets tossed around a lot and has started to lose some of its meaning. Like how many people have attended a staff meeting or gotten an email from a higher up somewhere reminding you to be mindful and you will feel better? Because I know that I have, and it honestly just kind of makes me want to throw up a little bit. But anyway, I digress. So in our situation, in this context, let's take mindfulness for its true meaning and use. So being mindful in a brave space means allowing yourself to be present with intention. Sometimes when we are dealing with difficult topics, or more likely in this situation, dealing with topics that we are very passionate about, it's easy to step out in our brains and start thinking about or worrying about or wanting to say something about other things, either things that are off topic, not connected, that kind of stuff. Or maybe it is connected and you're just really fired up. I'm not sure, but it's important to practice mindfulness and to bring yourself back, be present with the other learners in your space. So in a brave space, mindfulness looks like slowing down and pausing before reacting, and really focusing on enacting those first 5 pillars. So before I leave you today and send you off into this virtual world of learning and knowledge sharing, I want to offer you an invitation to a brave space. This poem is written by Mickey Scott Bay Jones, and actually originally was written by Beth Strano. And if you ever choose to use this poem in your own space or your own meetings or context, I recommend doing a little bit of research on it, because there is a little bit of controversy over this poem and who owns it and who took it. So I do think that that's an important piece to mention here. Anyway, an invitation to brave space. Together, we will create brave space, because there's no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have an excellent conference. Take care.
I'm so delighted to be introducing Mercedes Peters today. I am, might I say, a big fan of this person. I have not heard Mercedes speak live other than recorded TED Talks or presentations since I heard her defending her honors thesis in university. And I am so delighted to be inviting this person to teach us today. All of the concepts and ideas that she's going to present to us are things that will be literally foundational to the themes and the ideas throughout the rest of the conference. And geez, I just don't know what else to say. Mercedes is going to be doing a better introduction of herself with her bio and everything too. She is an extremely intelligent academic person with like so many different universities involvements between PhDs and being a professor and taking classes and being a lifelong learner. She's a historian, which is very close to my heart, with the idea of history being the foundation of what we are upon today and how it affects the present and the future. Mercedes, I will give the floor to you.
Lol and Somi, if you can all hear the cat wailing next to me, I'm sorry. He does what he wants. That's just probably going to happen quite a bit today, and there's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can we all see that right there? Perfect. Okay. Bayam Sidwan, Deloise, Mercedes, Peters, Akdaleowi, Menegwesk, Glooscap, First Nation. Good morning. Nope, it's not good morning. It is good afternoon. Hi, everybody. My name is Mercedes, and I was born in a place, if you can see right here in this slide that I've got, I was born in a place called Menegwesk, in another place called Wolastoquk. And if those of you who are from New Brunswick are aware, Wolastoquk is the name of the territory of the Wolastoqiyik, or the people of the beautiful river. Many of you would probably know this place as St. John, New Brunswick. I was born there, but I'm a band member of Glooscap First Nation, and I'm actually calling in from a place called Jabuktuk, or Great Harbor in our language, in Mi'kmaq territory, also what we call Mi'kmaqi. I'm coming at you as a PhD candidate in history, and my PhD is through the University of British Columbia, but I've come home to the territory to do the work that I do. I didn't feel that I was going to be able to do research on like by nation and nations that are allied with us if I wasn't actually in the territory building relationships with the people who were involved. The work that I do mainly now is that I study 60s, 70s, and 80s Wabanaki women's grassroots activism and community care work as a foundational aspect of Wabanaki sovereignty assertion. And this is where that treaty stuff that I'm going to be talking about today comes into play. As you can also tell by this particular photo right here, I also really, really like naps. I think naps are probably some of the most important things that we as human beings can do these days. And so I figured I would throw it in there too. So the reason that I wanted to call this a foundational talk is that when it comes to conferences, events, things like that, where we're talking about environmental issues, sustainability issues, issues of green economy, there is a lot of conversation about Indigenous peoples as stakeholders, but there's not a lot of actual engagement into Indigenous ideas. They're often kind of very quickly translated into ways that people who are of mainly European descent can understand, and we don't actually get into the nitty-gritty of what it is to engage with the peace and friendship treaties that shape the territory that we're on. And there are going to be a lot of discussions and conversations that you'll be having over the next couple of days where I figured this would be useful information to have. So that's going to be the foundation of the talk. And I've called it, this is where you start, treaty as a foundation for everything. And I mean that quite literally, for everything. Absolutely. Is there anybody, and you can drop this in chat and I can do my best to kind of, or at least maybe show like a hands up or something. If you are living in the maritime provinces, have you heard of what the peace and friendship treaties are? Okay, we got a hand up. We have a thumbs up. Got another, okay, we got a couple. So lots of people are popping up. For those of you who don't know, it's okay, because I'm going to be covering what that is a little bit today. If you live in the maritime provinces or even in the Atlantic, you live first on treaty territory, the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq or the Wolastoqiyik people. The existence of the maritime provinces, be that New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and even parts of Newfoundland and down into the state of Maine, are actually unceded territories of Indigenous nations. So the existence of Canada, the existence of those provinces, is actually established on those territories in ways that were never formally handed over. In many historical fields, or even anthropological fields, or kind of modern day conversations, these territories that a lot of us call home or assume as provinces are actually considered occupations. Now, that doesn't mean that this is going to be a talk about how everybody who comes from Europe or everybody whose families are descended from Europe has to get out. That's not what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is actually taking us back to a framework that actually helps us exist in these spaces together in a way that is sustainable for everyone. So before I get into the peace and friendship treaties and what they actually are and how they govern the territory, I'm actually going to tell you what they're not. Number one, those peace and friendship treaties are not a land acknowledgement on a website, syllabus, or email signature, and they're not a land acknowledgement that starts a conference or gets involved or opens up something. There's been more of a tendency to begin a lot of events or a lot of kind of public engagement with a land acknowledgement. That is not what those peace and friendship treaties are. They're also not a mechanism to make settlers feel guilty for colonization. People bringing up the idea we are all treaty people or honoring the treaties, it's not there to make folks feel guilty. And they're also not entirely about Wabanaki rights protection in Canadian and United States court systems, though they have come in handy. When I say that, I mean that those treaties can't grant land rights or even right to hunt, to fish, to exist, because those rights predate the existence of those treaties themselves, and they also predate the existence of the states that we're living in, be that Canada or the US. What those peace and friendship treaties are, and I think that's why I'm here today, is to kind of correct a little bit of a misunderstanding about what those treaties are. Is there a roadmap for a consistently sustainable and perpetually renewable relationship between all human and non-human kin on this earth? And there's a reason I refer to everyone and every other living being as kin, and I'll get into that in a little bit. When I say that treaty can be a foundation for everything, particularly in the context of this conference where we have educators and kind of policy developers in the room right now, it can inform the specifics of our day-to-day lives. It can inform, or those treaties can inform, how we interact with our students and our colleagues. It can inform how we build our syllabi, our course curriculums, and policy development that gets to determine those course curriculums. It can inform how we consider the systemic issues that our students and colleagues face in the context of their communities. And my favorite part, it can also inform how we plan to live fully and abundantly as we navigate this climate crisis that we're in the middle of right now. The spoiler is that I get to teach you from a perspective of being part of a people who have been surviving a climate crisis for the last 500 years and plan on doing so into the near future. Now, I've put a little asterisk on the fully and abundantly part, particularly the word abundantly, because I'm going to challenge your idea of what abundance is today. So I want you to toss your English and French dictionaries for a little bit, because I'm going to be taking that word and playing around with what it actually means. So the roadmap of today's talk is going to be a very quick romp through peace and friendship treaties, their history, and where they started, how we ended up here today. I'm also going to cover a fundamental difference between what we call a learned settler colonial worldview and the worldview of the Wabanaki nations that exist on this territory. I'll also explain what Wabanaki is. I'm going to cover 3 Mi'kmaq concepts that I call myself the do no harm trio. This would be Msitnogama, Netukulimk, and Eduawdmunk. Now, the reason I say Mi'kmaq is I can only give this talk from the perspective of a Mi'kmaq woman. I can also only give this talk from my own perspective. Don't treat me as representative of all Mi'kmaq. I'm not representative of all Wabanaki nations. And if you happen to live in Wolastoqiyik, it's important to listen to the people that operate in those communities and in those places. I can only deliver this from my perspective, and I can't really talk for anybody else. I'm also going to give you some tools that you can use to shift conversations away from the idea of individual survival, particularly in the context of a climate crisis, and toward what I want to call treaty-based community care. And there's a question that's probably at the forefront of a lot of your minds is how can we support a student's realistic career goals when resource extraction serves as the only option for a lot of people living in the Atlantic region today? This is something that I think a lot of us are familiar with, and it's a question that I think a lot of us are wrestling with, particularly when we consider that a lot of those resource extraction industries are positioning themselves as greener alternatives to what existed before. We call that greenwashing. They're not really changing practices, they're just kind of making it a little bit easier to pass environmental codes. So first of all, I keep saying this word Wabanaki. Why am I doing that? Well, because the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki peoples have actually existed in a political confederacy, kind of think like NATO, but with Indigenous peoples, for 400 years. We also existed before that point, having these kinds of political interactions and alliances amongst each other. We just solidified it into what we called the Wabanaki Confederacy in the 1680s. The reason I want to kind of give you an idea of Wabanaki peoples and Wabanaki nations is that we have existed not as ethnic groups, but as like literal political sovereign entities since long before Europeans came to these shores. And because of that, there has been this competing idea of what sovereignty or claim to territory is that has kind of been fought since the first day Europeans came over here. And in order to understand the way I'm going to talk about treaties versus the way that they're usually taught, I have to get at the core of this difference in worldview. So the European expansion around the planet that historians in my field, and now these days most people refer to as like colonialism and imperialism, is driven by this literal legal document or series of legal documents called the Doctrine of Discovery. This series of what they call papal bulls came from the Catholic Church in the Vatican in Rome. And it informed pretty well all colonial expansion right up from the 1600s forward. The idea was that, and you can find this in the very first book of the Christian Bible, Genesis, where the Christian God gives dominion over the earth to all men. Now, that is particularly treated like the earth is given to all Christians to do with whatever they pleased. People who weren't Christian didn't actually know how to treat the earth properly, and so they were sort of free game to be pushed out of the way for Christian European expansion. As Europeans start arriving over to what they decided to call the New World, though it was not new to the literally thousands of distinct nations of people that exist there, when they start coming over, they view these lands as an opportunity to create a new Garden of Eden, meaning they can take this land and they can change it to look like the world the way they want it to look. They can change it to exist in an image that they think fits them. This is the way that history is told. They arrive to the New World. They either meet super, super nice native people, or they kind of come into these territories where there is no one. And this is an opportunity for them to start fresh, to build wealth, to build a new life for themselves. And then slowly but surely, we march forward in human progress and we have the developed world that we have today. But the thing is, in that early period, despite this idea that this new territory that they'd come across was theirs for the taking, European peoples and later the colonies that they decided to establish on other people's territories kind of needed Wabanaki people to survive. Despite this doctrine of discovery saying that the Christian God had given everybody or like man dominion over the earth, the claiming Wabanaki land wasn't easy. A lot of people struggled and a lot of people relied on Wabanaki to survive. But at the same time, Wabanaki existed as a threat. We were in the way. This idea of God giving man dominion over the earth was all fine and dandy, but now you have these people who aren't Christian and were often referred to as savages, quite literally in the way of that image that they wanted to grow into. There is a different way of seeing the world, though, when you're Wabanaki. And as this relationship starts developing between European people who are coming over and Wabanaki nations, the different groups have to start learning to live together. They have to start learning to work together. And what we see then is the development of these treaties. Now, the one thing that I want to bring up before I go into what those actual treaties are is that there was already a political culture in existence in these lands before Europeans show up. There's a way of interacting with other humans, with other non-humans, and a way of existing in this world to make sure everything was balanced, to make sure everybody could work together, to make sure everybody could thrive and survive. And so when European nations start interacting with Wabanaki and either siding with Wabanaki to fight their own wars on Wabanaki territory, they often have to make those treaties on Wabanaki terms. That's not actually how we talk about treaties when they're taught today, though. So here's what I want to show you. I'm not going to go through every peace and friendship treaty that was signed because that is going to take us forever. Here is a brief overview of the various treaties that were signed between British and French and Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and all of the other Wabanaki nations from 1725 right up until 1779. Now, many of these treaties are ceasefires after treaty relationships that were established were broken. But the core of those treaties remains the same thing. Key to every peace and friendship treaty that is signed between Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik people and British people who have come over and sort of beaten the French and established a claim to the territory that they never really had, none of these treaties ceded land or gave land to anyone. As Europeans come over and they're starting to establish their communities, they're establishing the community with the idea that this land is theirs for the taking. But they're coming up against Wabanaki peoples who don't have that conception of sovereignty, and we'll get into that in a minute, and who are also unwilling to get out of the way to allow these Europeans to let their vision of the world come to fruition. And so they start getting into fights and they start battling and fighting with each other. And every time Wabanaki nations seem to be winning. And so these treaties are at first ceasefires, but what they also do is put little provisions in there that protect Wabanaki right to land, livelihood, and culture. But the most important part of those treaties, and this is what you're not going to see in the texts themselves, is that all of those treaties bind Britain and all of their descendants into a kinship bond with Wabanaki people and their kin. And they also do it in perpetuity. So the way Wabanaki political culture worked with both humans and non-humans is that you were seen as part of a living system that was always connected all the time. Meaning if you enter into a political alliance with somebody, you're not just seeing them as somebody that you can call on if you need help. You are becoming a member of their family. And when you become a member of someone's family or you become kin, you have a responsibility to them. You have a responsibility not to harm them, but you also have a responsibility to make sure that these people can live and thrive. Wabanaki treaty culture was also about ceremony and gifts and acknowledging the kind of personhood that existed in the other treaty parties. And our treaties were often done up, if you want to talk about it that way, on wampum belts. Now, wampum belts are made out of wampum shells. They're usually purple and white. And the key thing about wampum belts, aside from the fact that they symbolically tell the story of the agreement of the treaty, is that wampum belts have to be cleaned consistently. And so you always have to revisit that wampum belt. You have to go back, you have to clean it. And every time you clean it, you have to tell the story of that treaty and that agreement to remind yourself of the responsibility that you have to these kin that you've entered into relationship with. When Europeans entered into various treaties with Wabanaki nations, there was no land signed over. That was an assumption that particularly British people and also French people made about their ability to claim territory that was never theirs to take in the first place. They assumed they had it, so they just took it. But what it actually did over days and days of ceremony that's not recorded in the treaty texts is quite literally welcomed British and French folks and all of their descendants and all newcomers to come into a kinship relationship in perpetuity. These treaties aren't a series of documents that are put forward from the 1700s or the early 1700s to the late 1700s. They're about entering into a relationship with peoples who had existed in this land for quite literally 10,000 years before that point. But it's not just about a relationship with people. And that's another thing that I kind of want to bring up today. The treaties are more than their texts. If we take a look at those peace and friendship treaties as like a legal agreement between Wabanaki nations and the British, we are misinterpreting them. These particular texts, as you can see right here, those texts were forgotten about very quickly and shoved into the back room at like Nova Scotia Archives or New Brunswick Archives for them to be dug up and found in the 70s during land rights battles. But those texts break down. And that's kind of a metaphorical view of how European and then later European Canadian treaty partners sort of viewed that relationship. They let it break down. If we focus on the text itself, we're actually missing context of like days of ceremony, gift giving, and welcoming of those treaty partners to the land into relationship with us as kin. But it's not creating a new kinship relationship either. Those peace and friendship treaties are welcoming of new kin into an already existing extended familial landwork or network. And that's made up of humans, animals, plants, water, and the land itself. When we talk about those peace and friendship treaties as just this series of texts or legal agreements that were made in the 1700s, we're looking at it from a solely European style point of view that later became the Canadian point of view. And there are two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world that come into play when we talk about treaties. And I want to talk about the Wabanaki way because that way doesn't get talked about enough. With colonial oppression, the European Canadian worldview is given more power at the expense of other worldviews, to the point where this European Canadian worldview that gets established as Europeans come over with this idea of, well, the land is ours for the taking because we're God's chosen ones, to the point where it just became sort of the way of being. The land was assumed to be theirs. They either won it fair and square by like defeating us out of existence, or they got it in the treaties, which they didn't. But it's normalized to the point where it's seen as just the way things are. People from Europe showed up here because that was just the inevitable result of human progress. Things are developing the way that they should, and people who are fighting against it just aren't getting with the times. So there's a way of kind of seeing the world through a European point of view that makes it very difficult for people who were taught this European point of view to call it a European or European Canadian point of view. They just see it as a point of view. The first thing I want to do today is point it out to everyone that the way treaties are talked about publicly are often talked about through a European point of view. And that European point of view does two things. And I'm going to give you two key points that you can take with you. If you take nothing else from this presentation, I want you to take these 2 points. And these are from my work as a historian that is educated in a university, which is also very much part of establishing this kind of European or European Canadian worldview amongst lots of people. So this doesn't actually always come from my Mi'kmaq point of view. It actually comes from some of the European Canadian worldviews I've been taught. Lesson number 1, nothing ever just is. Nothing exists in a vacuum. The way you see the world has to come from somewhere. If a human is talking about it, it has an origin. It has to be made. It has to be constructed, which also means that it can be changed. Nothing just is the way that it is. The world doesn't just work because it works that way. People had to get it to that point. And number 2, there are very few things that are inevitable. If you are a physicist and you are sitting in this audience, please keep quiet about things like the forces of gravity or the inevitable heat death of the universe. We know those things are inevitable, but that's not what we're talking about here. If it is where we are existing on this planet right now, nothing is inevitable. The way the world has turned out doesn't have to be that way, and it rarely looks like it's going to turn out that way as these things are playing out. Which means the reason that one worldview gets talked about more than another worldview isn't just because it had to happen that way or it happened that way out of the blue. These things are deliberate. They have to be built a certain way. I'm going to break down what a European worldview is, or a European Canadian worldview. And another way to put it is calling it a settler colonial worldview. I'll get into settler colonialism in a second. But this settler colonial worldview, and we're living in Canada, and Canada is what we call a settler state. I'll explain what that is in a second. The way European Canadians think about the world all goes back to land. Let me explain. Land, water, air, even animals are viewed as inanimate. They can be owned. In some cases, people have also been owned through this worldview. But land, water, air, and animals, inanimate objects, or at least they're less important than human beings. Now, when land becomes an object, when land is something that can be owned, it immediately becomes a finite resource. There's only so much land to go around. There's only so much space to go around. That's part one. Another foundational part of this settler colonial Canadian worldview, the idea of land and the environment, and even how we attach ourselves to it, is that ownership over land is the basis of kind of our wealth accumulation, and wealth creates power. What I mean is, wealth in this world is created, or you have the ability to support yourself financially the most if you have ownership over a plot of land or ownership over a company or something like that. But every resource that exists on this planet comes from our earth in some way, shape, or form. Even virtual things like social media, things like that, internet stuff has to come from the earth somewhere. There needs to be somewhere where these servers are kept. So all of our wealth, all of our power, all of our ability to kind of do things in the world comes from the earth itself. The more wealth you have, the more pieces of land and resources that you get to have a hold of, the more power you have. But when you think of it as a finite resource, as something that can be owned, it also creates something called a scarcity mindset. You have to work to get a hold of these resources in order to get ahead. There's not always enough to go around. And so sometimes stopping and taking a break isn't enough. In order to get any sort of power in this world, you need to be able to have access to wealth that comes from the land, or at least owning things. This concept of owning things is very European. There's also a focus on individual ownership or individual responsibility or individual freedom of choice. A lot of us, when we're coming up in the school system, it's about, our uniqueness as individuals, our individual responsibility. We have to be good people. We have to do things for other people, but we need to work hard on our own to kind of get ahead or be a productive member of society. Another key point of view of this European settler colonial worldview is that humans are the most intelligent, or at least most valuable beings on the planet. A Wabanaki worldview is almost completely opposite. I'll show you. So land, water, air, non-human beings are not viewed as inanimate. They're viewed as living, animate. Many of our cultures see them as having like a soul or a life essence. In this context, I'll say they have personhood, full being, full personhood recognized in all things, which means I am no more or less valuable than the trees in my yard or the water or the very land itself. We also have no concept of ownership, or at least we have actively made the choice to refuse ownership as we exist in that interrelated system that I talked about earlier. We see the world as a system of living beings that need to work together to respect one another. And when nothing is owned, it ensures that we can all access the abundance that the earth has to offer. Now, remember, I told you to put a pin in your understanding of abundance, and we'll get to that later because you might be a little bit uncomfortable with what I'm saying right now. Instead of individual responsibility and individual sort of success, we're very much community-minded people. The world is based on community connection and responsibility. Now, this doesn't mean a loss of your individuality. It just means honoring the differences that exist between you and another being, and coexisting and maybe compromising to make sure that everybody has what they need, as opposed to humans being the most valuable or intelligent beings on Earth. In a Wabanaki worldview, all beings are kin. When I say recognize through difference here, I mean, oftentimes Indigenous peoples are positioned as people who speak for the environment. We speak for the voiceless. We give voice to things like trees or plants because they can't speak for themselves. In a Wabanaki worldview, they absolutely can. You just have to spend enough time getting to learn their language and understanding them in order to understand what they're saying. That's what we mean by recognizing through difference. We don't have to speak the same language. We don't have to have the same worldview. I can honor somebody from where they're at, or I can honor a being from where they're at, and my connection with them to respect and honor them, and not have to actually understand the language that they're speaking. The core of the Wabanaki worldview, or at least the Mi'kmaq language version of the Wabanaki worldview, is what I've come to call the do no harm trio. And it's all based on this concept of there is room for all relations to live in abundance on this planet, which is a little bit of a risky thing to say when we're dealing with a climate crisis, drought, economic issues, things like that. The Mi'kmaq worldview, and it kind of expands to Wabanaki worldview, just different words and phrases. At the core of it is this concept of msitnogama. You might have heard it as said or described as all my relations. And that goes to that idea that all beings are kin. We are related to everything and everyone, not necessarily by blood, but by responsibility. That's where that kinship comes in. You can see that most reflected through this idea of like 7 generational thinking. We're always making decisions that aren't just impacting kin that exist right now today. We're also thinking about kin that will have 7 generations in the future every time we make a decision. The other concept is renewable. And those of you working in maybe an environmental field may have heard it described as two-eyed seeing. But renewable doesn't just mean two-eyed seeing. The Mi'kmaq elders, Albert Marshall and Merdina Marshall, when they came up with this term, they actually describe it as something more like understanding that there is a gift in multiple perspectives. Not multiple perspectives kind of blending together, but there's a gift in recognizing the differences that people and beings bring to the table. This is something that allows us to coexist with people who may see the world differently than us, but still recognize that kinship in them. And then here's a more common one that people think about when they're thinking about environmental stuff, Netukulimk. It translates directly to like take only what you need and waste nothing. But in order to describe it to you in a way that's going to make the most sense, that reflects a Wabanaki and specifically Mi'kmaq worldview that every being in the world, and to us, that is the land, the grass, the air, the water, animals, we have a fundamental recognition of the being or personhood in everything. These 3 concepts blended together are the foundation of Wabanaki treaty thinking. Our relationship with kin, our relationship with, say, a non-human being, let's take lobsters, for example, is based on a treaty relationship. So our relationship with kin is based on our idea of treaty, even if we haven't signed a formal treaty with them. And our treaties are best described as interactions based on freely given consent. If you do not respect your kin, they have the full right to withdraw their consent and withdraw from their relationship with you. If we don't take care of our lobster kin, for example, if we don't treat them properly, they stop feeding us. They go away, whether that's quite literally leaving the area to go somewhere else or the population dies off. But we view that resource, if you would see it through a European point of view, as kin. And if we are not responsible to them, they withdraw from the relationship and the whole system is thrown out of balance. That sort of thinking and seeing the personhood in everything allows us to move forward in our treaty relationships with other human beings. We want to exist in such a way that allows us to recognize their personhood, their value, and their differences from us. But we also have to make sure that we don't harm the world in such a way that's going to make it difficult for them to live there. All of these three concepts built into our treaty negotiations and our treaty agreements mean that there should be room for every being to live here in full abundance. Everything is balanced. Everyone has what they need. No one goes without. Now, Canada is what we call a settler state. And what that means is that it's founded on a bedrock of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is an ongoing structure that continues to shape the country that we live in, and the US and a bunch of other countries around the world, and the way that people relate to it and others to this day. Settler colonialism is about controlling land for the benefit of the settlers that come here from their home territories. And they come from those home territories and settle here, and the goal is to eventually cut ties with those territories, to use the wealth of the land in these territories to benefit themselves. They want to create their own identity in these places so that they can thrive and live in a world and benefit from it. The problem is that they build these new lives on top of sovereign peoples that already existed, but not just people, land, plants, animals, and they interact with those in ways that make it so that land can be owned, animals can be owned, people can be owned. They're a resource to create wealth. But these other peoples exist, and they're in the way of that being realized because they're not going to give up their land, especially if they don't have a concept of owning it. So settler colonial structures then have to get rid of those sovereign peoples in order to make their claim to land and their connection to it secure. Problem is, when those people in question are not disappearing, like Indigenous peoples that exist in these territories and whose territories these are, the system continues to work to get rid of them, whether that is through genocide, systemic oppression, things like that. This makes settler colonialism an ongoing structure. And what I mean by that is Canada has always existed on somebody else's land. There are very few cases where any land grant was freely given to Canada. They either had to invade it or just assume that land that wasn't theirs was theirs. And so already Canada's sovereignty is on shaky ground, and that's by Canadian legal standards. As long as Indigenous peoples exist to put that claim to land in question, we always become a thorn in their side. And so these systems either have to go on in ways where people aren't paying attention to them. That's just how things are. So that's just the way that it is. Or they actively have to be pushed forward. This is what we're dealing with in the Canadian situation. That settler colonial point of view also thrives on being invisible. And what I mean by that is the best way to convince a group of settlers and their future generations to forget that they came from another place, in this case, Europe, is to pretend as though they have always been here. This land is always theirs. And this is just the way that things are. It also kind of makes it so that we don't talk about things like settler colonialism, or that the idea of a European Canadian is a weird term. Settler colonialism has to be so normal that people don't think it's an option. Key number 2 is that settler colonialism isn't just about Indigenous peoples versus European settlers. It also literally hurts everyone, including eventually those European settlers. Some just notice it a lot earlier than other peoples do. If you're interested in that sort of talk, you can check out Ingrid Waldron's There's Something in the Water to talk about examples of not just environmental racism, but the way that environmental issues impact people who are poor before they impact people with more money. So settler colonialism, that idea that land can be owned, land is for the benefit of settlers to generate wealth, to get more power, is eventually going to hurt those settlers too. So it's not just about Native people asking for their land back. It is a system of oppression that will eventually harm everyone. And we're starting to see that with the climate crisis. Key number 3 to understanding settler colonialism in this brief overview is that if we don't make it visible, or if we don't start treating it as weird or something that exists, something that not just is, but something that is constructed and made, we actually risk using those settler colonial tools to solve the problems that settler colonialism causes. So what do we do about those issues? Well, the first step is to learn to see what settler colonialism is and see it in action. And the good news is that we all share space with beings who have been pointing it out to us for centuries. Wildlife has been showing us that the way that we're treating the earth is actively harming our chances at living in it well for a very long time. Indigenous peoples have been trying to explain that the way that we're treating our kin on this earth has sort of hurt our chances on living on the earth well. There are people who know what it looks like because there are people who have lived with settler colonialism as something that is abnormal for a very long time. One of those ways that settler colonial thinking, settler colonial structures stay invisible is focusing on that individual responsibility, that individual like uniqueness, or I'm the only one who makes decisions to make my life better, that individual responsibility, as opposed to making systemic change or systems needing to change. When we put the onus on individuals to make change, like you're the one who needs to recycle more, you should drive your bike more to work, it puts that onus on individuals to fix problems that actually require full structural overhaul, changing the way our society thinks and works. And this you can see particularly in the way things like racism or conversation about pollution or wealth disparity is actually presented in our education and social systems as a moral failure. So when I was growing up in the school system, things like racism are taught as like, you're a bad person if you're a racist. You're a bad person if you pollute. You're a bad person if you don't give money to people on the street. But that results in a few issues. First, it links moral goodness to being not racist when something like racism or environmental destruction are systemic. That means that people who perpetuate those systems or benefit those systems and thus continue to perpetuate from them think, well, there's no way I'm involved in this because I am morally good. So that means that people aren't looking at themselves reflexively to see how they participate in these systems of oppression. But also on the flip side makes them think that they're powerless. Well, I'm just one person. I can't do anything. You'll also see this kind of framing make it more likely so that others are blaming individual people for facing structural barriers to becoming progressive citizens. So in the issue, when we're trying to get students to think about the environment as they move into their future, some students are going to be able to afford to spend the time to not get into environmentally damaging fields. But there are other students who may come from lower economic backgrounds who may have less of a choice. And then people who see morality linked to your ability to choose to be good or not, those people are looked down upon. It also creates the guilt freeze. So people will be too afraid to ask a question, or they'll be too afraid to say something, do something, or take action on something because they're too scared of saying the wrong thing, being seen as racist, being seen as environmentally unfriendly, things like that. And so they're less able to make the changes that they need. They're less willing to learn because they're too scared to look morally unsound. But that invisibility, the way that we kind of treat it as an individual responsibility to change the world in this kind of like European settler colonial system, keeps us from seeing ourselves as an interrelated part of a community that can hold us up and create change and help us create change on the scale that we need. When we don't see ourselves or recognize ourselves as a part of an interrelated community, and whether we want to admit that we're a part of the community or not isn't the point. It's whether we can see it. There's also a perpetuation of like fear and distrust. When you see something like land or food or wealth as something that is finite, anyone trying to make a change to that system where you're desperately just trying to survive becomes an enemy. People are less willing to hear each other out. People are less willing to talk to other people because they're trying to seem safe or morally good. And that's not what we want. We want to be able to exist within a community that benefits everyone, right? This is what I mean. So this scarcity mindset that I brought up earlier, when we treat like land and resources as finite, inanimate objects that can be owned and generate wealth as opposed to kin, we actually start living on this like scarcity mindset that continues to make these systemic issues that are causing our problems invisible and sets up barriers to us actually doing something about them. So I've put up some like news clippings of things that I had seen in the news the past couple of years, particularly linking Indigenous peoples as being like against job creation. So Indigenous peoples as wanting folks who are just trying to survive in the Maritimes to not work the jobs that they need. And so the failure to economically develop is often blamed on environmentalists or usually Indigenous peoples. Take, for example, the pulp mill at Boat Harbor. Set on the banks of Pictou Landing First Nation, has been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor for decades that has actively harmed not just that community and future generations, but like Nova Scotia in general's ability to be able to use that water, fish in that water, things like that. But that's not what gets discussed. What gets discussed is when activism from Pictou Landing finally resulted in the province shutting down the mill, Indigenous peoples were blamed for cutting into Nova Scotia's economic development, its ability to access resources and wealth to make everyone's lives bigger. There's not enough to go around, so people who are asking us to change the way we do things are getting in our way to survive. The people that are impacted by this job loss are not the people with a lot of wealth and power. They're people whose jobs are intimately connected to, or livelihoods are intimately connected to the way that the province chooses to invest its money. We see it again with the pulling of the plug on that Energy East pipeline that was going to go through here a couple of years ago. Eventually, after dealing with various barriers and describing those barriers as Indigenous protest and activist protest, pipeline company ended up shooting down or shutting down the project. And the discussions within the province of New Brunswick were that they're disappointed, the project would have created jobs, and yet again, Indigenous peoples thinking about the earth, thinking about the 7 generations in front of them, but also thinking about the people whose jobs are getting cut. They are the ones who are blamed. The one thing I want to point out is this is what a scarcity mindset looks like. It's also an example of this is just the way that things are. How are we supposed to make money out here if we're not getting involved in resource extraction? Well, there are lots of ways to do that. We just have to think about the way that the world works. This scarcity mindset also creates and generates things like xenophobia. Because if there are only so many jobs to go around, people who are coming from elsewhere are also people who are coming to take those jobs. They become enemies as opposed to kin. But in a Wabanaki worldview, this is what abundance actually looks like. Abundance doesn't mean being able to own as many properties as possible or having a lot of money. It means everyone is able to live and thrive in the land the way that it is. And that means bringing in newcomers. That doesn't mean shutting the gates for people. Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey saw newcomers way back in the day and welcomed them, not because we were naive or primitive and had no idea who was coming. We knew of the existence of other nations, but because we understood that there was space and could be space and enough room and enough everything for everyone. There's always space for everyone. And in the face of everything, colonial oppression, economic crises, climate crises, even some of the health issues and structural issues that we're facing now, many of us still maintain this deep understanding that there is enough room and more people can join. We've lived through 500 years of colonial oppression and genocide and economic collapse and, yes, climate crisis, because there has been a rapid change in the world that we knew it and our ability to hunt and fish and survive ourselves. But there is a way to live, and we know how to do it, and we know how to live well. We also kind of want this for everybody. So now what? What do we do as people in the room who may not be Mi'kmaq or Wolastoqiyik, who maybe don't have an understanding of what those treaties are, or even that there is a difference in the way that we see the world, or that there is a word to describe the way that we see the world as opposed to that's just the way things are? What do we do? Well, we can re-envision, or at least remember, that community and kin are possible beyond culture lines with humans, but also beyond like life type lines. As educators and policymakers and more, we have a chance to encourage and empower others to keep an eye to the future, 7 generations ahead, and not just in that economic wealth generation sense, but in a survival and thriving sense. But we can also keep an understanding of the realities of the present, but also the potential in that present. Treaty, as a relationship, not a legal text, asks us to see all of the ways that we can exist in community with one another, and to also foster trust in that community, that that community is going to have your back, that that community will eventually remove barriers that make the world where there is space for everyone a widespread reality. We can think about how to shift conversations away from individual success, responsibility, and yes, survival toward community care and long-term survival. Getting students to think about there being another possible world aside from things just are the way they are can actually go a long way into getting them to think outside the box and what the world could be. Just because the maritime provinces rely on resource extraction for jobs and economy doesn't mean that they actually have to. We can also start building the systems that are equitable, that actively challenge this idea of scarcity and the productivity value, and help students build communities that they trust in. This is going to help them learn to operate based on a responsibility to themselves and to their kin, as opposed to a fear of poverty. So this also, though, looks like recognizing that there are some students in this generation, and maybe a few in the future, that may have no choice but to go work for an oil refinery, especially if that oil refinery is recruiting students from lower income homes as a way of getting out of poverty, as a way of getting ahead, as a way of generating wealth in this world where if you don't work, you don't get anything. They can learn to operate based on, okay, I can make choices, knowing that my community is going to have my back, knowing that I will not go without, and I'll be able to say no to these things instead. But this also means that we have to start radically repositioning what communities are and can be. We need to think about how manufactured power imbalances, and yes, I mean manufactured, they are created and they have to be maintained, how they impact us, our students, our communities, and we really have to push back against them. Settler colonialism, like I said, isn't just about Native people versus people of European descent. It systematically oppresses Indigenous people, all forms of racialized folks, queer people, trans people, gender diverse people, women, disabled folks, poor folks, and migrants in ways that make forming those communities that mean that there's room for everyone extremely difficult. It also makes that kind of abundance that I'm talking about very difficult. That treaty responsibility, the core of the treaty, not the text, the responsibility to each other is about making sure that there is enough space for everyone. And it's about understanding that even now it is still possible. That may mean for a lot of us in this room, though, understanding that in a settler colonial worldview, power means taking up a lot of space or having the ability to see the world being just the way it is, because that's just how things are. In a Wabanaki worldview, the more power you have, the more power you're asked to give up, which means you're often asked to stop and listen the most. And we can do a lot of listening, but we also can't really forget to do either. There's going to be a lot of things that you're going to be learning from other people over the next couple of days. Specifically on the ground, how to operate in a classroom setting, how to think about the world maybe the way that Wabanaki people do, where you may be asked to draw attention to the way that the worldview that you have has gone unquestioned, or that you even actually have a worldview that can be challenged, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And listening and learning is good, but there's also going to have to come a point where you actually start to enact these systems. Because we can talk until we're blue in the face, but until we start living as though this community is possible and seeing a treaty relationship not as a series of texts between British people and Mi'kmaq, but a kind of law of the territory, a law of the land that predates relationships between nation states and Indigenous nations. If we start to see it as a relationship, then we actually kind of have to do the work to make it a reality again. The thing is that reality is already existing in our communities in smaller ways. We just have to be able to see it. Kind of want to finish on that slide right here, because I think it's a really good way of, in one picture, summarizing the kind of mood that I want to get to, which is it has to start somewhere and it has to start sometime. What better place than here? What better time than now? The world didn't get this way just because that just happens to be the forward march of time. The world got this way because people are making it happen, which means that people can unmake it. Might just involve a change in perspective or the ability to recognize that you actually have a perspective and that someone else's might be different and might hold some keys to a new way of being. Thank you.
Wow. I would like to ask if anybody has any questions for Mercedes. Feel free to write in the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute. I know that was also a lot to digest. So actually, AJ in the chat, I agree, that was one of the best talks I've ever heard. Why don't we just like take a minute to just like breathe a bit and digest this, and then I will give you a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, that works. Because it's definitely a lot. And I admittedly struggled with how to put that into a presentation too. Because like trying to explain like the fundamental pieces of a worldview that folks like might not even realize they have. And I'm like, oh, dude. So you take a minute.
Mercedes, I have a question. So the work that you're talking about and this idea of, I guess, just recognizing that everything is made and can be unmade, I think is like a big idea for a lot of people. And if you've never considered, you know, for example, that like humans made capitalism and we can unmake capitalism, then yeah, this is a really big idea. But one thing that you talked about right at the start was you had mentioned the land acknowledgements. And this is something that for me as white settler, I have gone back and forth on, and I've listened to so many Indigenous scholars and Indigenous people and elders. And I feel like everybody has a different take on land acknowledgements and where the value is in them. And I think that I work hard when I do land acknowledgements to make them personal and to make them like meaningful in the sense that it's not just like a robotic script of them. But I think that sometimes we are also required to use land acknowledgements in a lot of situations. So I was just wondering if you had any advice or tips for making those land acknowledgements meaningful in our settings when we have to talk about them or have to bring them up.
So let me preface this the same way I kind of preface my talk. I am like one Mi'kmaq person.
Yes.
You had kind of also, and you framed it like lots of, and like sometimes we don't even agree, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like still human, right? The way that I view land acknowledgements. I remember like the first time I heard one, and it's only actually been recently that they've started. In Canada in particular, you really only start to see it after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission dropped its final report in 2015, when Canadians are now like dealing with this word called colonialism and like, oh, like, did we do it? Like, like that's this really like weird thing, right? And that kind of moral connection that I tried to get at a little bit, but like was also zooming through, is that like, okay, no one wants to be a bad person. So crap, we got to do all of these things the right way because I don't want to be perceived as colonial or racist. And like, here's the point. If we exist in a colonial racist system, we kind of already are. So I think uncoupling that morality with it and like, you know, that can also help recognizing that these things are systemic. The way that I view land acknowledgements is that because I view territory as relative, I knew what unceded meant by the time I was 7. Land acknowledgements are something that I've already done my whole life and continue to do, and are not necessarily for me. Because when I go to somebody else's territory, I already know inevitably whose territory I'm going to be. I know how to hold myself accountable. I am walking there as a Mi'kmaq, kind of like diplomat, right? Not just with like the people, but like the land and everything that's there. And so I think sometimes land acknowledgements are important, but I also think that it's really difficult to understand what a land acknowledgement is when you maybe come from a people or a worldview that doesn't recognize land as kin. And so now you're just like, you're telling a lot of people like, oh, colonialism happens, and if we do this, we're good now. Like it's more than that. I think the land acknowledgement needs to continue in the way that we operate. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of a way to nod like, hey, you're on someone else's territory. True. Like, absolutely. This is, you know, you've got people who have a relationship tens of thousands of years older than maybe your ancestors have. But I think also the issue that I have with land acknowledgements, it's just a, look, we're progressive, and it's got to be more than that. Is there like an actual answer to that question? No. But I definitely think the idea of kind of changing our relationship and starting to see that there is a kinship there may also change your relationship with the land acknowledgement itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that I just so often attend events, and it's just like the land acknowledgement is so painful to watch, and it's just like it feels so inauthentic. And I understand why people think that they are not meaningful, but I also have seen some that are really well done, right? Where they're like, there's more, I guess, like action-based acknowledgement in what's being said, if that makes sense.
I see there's 2 questions with raised hands and also a very quick one from the chat. So AJ, you'll be up next after this quick question of, can you be hired to come into a classroom and speak to students? Cindy's.
So the honest answer is I am a grad student. If you pay me, if I have time, I would love to, because I also, you know, enjoy talking to people. Also, take a look at the folks who are in your area too, because there's going to be a lot of people who think similarly to the way that I do. There's a lot of really important educators out there. Like, if I'm in your area, cool, awesome. I still need to eat though. So if you have, you know, that would be helpful. But also think about the people that exist in your community as well, because I'm not the only voice out there.
AJ?
You are a particularly excellent voice, though. Thanks so much for your talk. My question is, I was wondering if you could share with us just a little bit about your own observations and experience in terms of how your understanding of Mi'kmaq and Wabanaki concepts have maybe sharpened as a result of traveling across and living in and working in other Indigenous territories. Some of the differences, some of the similarities, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I tell people this all the time. I spent 3 years in what a lot of you would know as Vancouver, BC. It's this spot where the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people like converge and interact, because the idea of a border in Indigenous worlds doesn't really exist. It's more of like a relational, like, hey, we hang out here together sort of thing. But I used to say, you don't realize how Mi'kmaq you are until you leave the territory. And genuinely, that's the case, because our identity as Mi'kmaq people actually comes from the land itself. Our knowledge, our like language is land-based. We have this concept, Wedgie Squariariak, which literally means we sprouted from here. So the way that we see the world actually comes from the land itself and our relationships with, you know, the animals and other beings that exist in this particular territory. And so our knowledge is contextual, but it's also kind of based in this respect that I've seen a lot of peoples, not just, you know, who are recognized as Indigenous peoples around the world, but like people who also have cultures that come from the land itself have. And it's this kind of, again, giving being to not just humans and value to not just humans. And so when I approach a different territory, I approach it as a Mi'kmaq person. I don't try to become a Musqueam person because that feels weird and appropriative. I treat myself as a kind of diplomat. So I will show up as Mi'kmaq and I'm like, this is how we do stuff where I'm from. Show me how to respect like the relations here. How do I do this in a way that like sees the humanity in people? But again, it's with that recognizing difference. I think when some people are like, well, you're here, you have to respect what's here kind of thing, it's done in a sort of assimilatory, gross, yucky kind of way, where that idea of that eduabdimum, which is like that gift of multiple perspectives, that's where that difference can exist in place. Everything can be true at once, all can kind of exist. And so my view specifically as Mi'kmaq has absolutely been like sharpened. And I think there are ways that I just sort of like thought in my head, oh, well, yeah, like I'm not Cree or I'm not Mohawks. They're not going to have the same things. But the way Indigenous peoples are often treated around the world too, it's like, well, we're all the same. We're all Indigenous. And that's not the case either. I've also been sort of, you know, if ever I'm talking somewhere or like doing a class, I'm seen as the representative of all Indigenous folks everywhere, all the time. And that is also extremely harmful because someone will be like, well, like Mercedes Peters said this, and that's what Mi'kmaq people or Wabanaki people think. And I'm like, no, because I just got into a fight with my cousin the other day about that, right? And so I think also even being treated as an Indigenous representative of like all Indigenous people in someone else's territory, I'm like, whoa, like this is not. So I am very careful because of that sort of like universalizing idea. And why I often will suggest to people to like recognize whose territory you're on, because there is a context there, but there's also a relationship that is unique to that place that you can develop with human and non-human kin in the area. So short answer is, yeah, absolutely. And the how, I'm still figuring that out because it still comes out all the time.
Amazing.
Thanks,
We've
Jess.
got about 5 minutes left. There's a question in the chat and there's 2 raised hands. I hope we can get to them. So the question in the chat is, politics can also have some basis in power, though different to different cultures, as you mentioned. How did the Wabanaki political systems and entities view land borders for their territories? Evidently, I'm trying to word this question as openly as possible, coming from a colonial view, so I'm wondering how a confederacy would be formed if there were no formal nations to join together.
I love this question, and I'm going to try to answer it as quickly as possible because I could talk about this all day. Remember how I asked you all to kind of take that English or French definition of abundance and throw it out the window? Because again, I'm using like a different language to portray something that is inherent that doesn't really get through in that language. Same thing with the idea of nation. So to refer to, for example, as like no formal nations to join together, well, the existence of the nation as people understand it today, this nation state, it's really only been around since the 1600s. And if we think about the existence of all of human, like, you know, the 200 or so, I'm not a biologist. We've been around for a while. That is a blip in human history. The concept of the nation is also manufactured. So the reason I use the word nation to refer to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, is to get others who maybe come from that European point of view to recognize them as sovereign political entities. Borders are also very new and very specifically constructed to regulate movement, to allow certain people to travel all over the world and certain other people who are deliberately put into positions of less power to either move a lot more or move not at all. So borders are also very new, the way that you might like see them from like a colonial point of view. I would recommend Harshawalia's Border and Rule. It's a pretty good book if you want to kind of learn how all of that stuff is manufactured and created. But our borders, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit when I was talking about Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, is it's all relationship based. A certain group may have a responsibility because they have a better connection with a certain area of land to take care of it better. And they might, you know, take care of it up to a certain point. And then there might be other people who can like take care of it up to another certain point, but they're also interacting and negotiating with each other. And so this idea of border or nation in English might mean one thing, but if I were to say it in English from my perspective as a Mi'kmaq or like a Wolastoqey person could do it, it would still mean something different. So I'll put the name of Harshawalia. There we go. Thanks, Omi. But yeah, so those borders, the way you saw it on that map, are still not necessarily accurate because we were also traveling around and negotiating with others. But would definitely recommend looking into the history of what a nation is, the way that like European states, like the Treaty of Westphalia, things like that, and then also the creation of like things like borders, passports, and stuff. But I'm going to stop because we could talk about this all day.
Sadia?
Merci. Thank you for your presentation. I will ask my question is in French. Moi, je voulais comme savoir comment tu vois cette vision aussi de tout ce qui est colonisation, mais je suis un immigrant là, puis je viens d'un pays d'Afrique centrale, puis j'ai étudié ici au Nouveau-Brunswick, puis à l'école, d'habitude, ce qu'on nous apprend, c'est que on dit que la découverte de l'Amérique a été faite par Christophe Colomb. Comme si l'Amérique était comme une terre qui était vierge, il n'y avait personne qui vivait là-dedans. Puis Christophe Colomb est venu en bateau, puis il a fait une découverte, puis c'est entré dans les livres d'histoire. So, même sur Wikipédia, lorsqu'on met Christophe Colomb, dit il a découvert l'Amérique, alors qu'en vrai, dit c'est faux. La terre était déjà habitée. Donc, mais pour quelqu'un qui est comme vu de l'extérieur, puis on te raconte ça dans une école, là, puis tu grandis avec ce genre d'histoire comme si l'Amérique était une terre vierge qui a été découverte. Puis je me demandais si ça n'influence pas aussi la mauvaise compréhension des traités, parce que si on grandit avec cette idée que l'Amérique était une terre vierge, ça veut dire que la terre n'appartenait à personne. So, comment est-ce qu'on pourrait comme essayer de mieux comprendre le fait que c'est une terre c'est la terre de quelqu'un, il faut la respecter, il faut respecter les gens qui étaient là. Alors que dans toute l'histoire, on a essayé comme d'effacer toute cette trace des Premières Nations, puis, mais aussi d'effacer toute cette, je dirais, cette culture qui était déjà mise en place. Donc, puis ma deuxième tranche de question, c'est comment est-ce qu'on peut faire pour changer des choses? Parce que ça c'est très ancré, puis il faudra changer la mentalité. Est-ce qu'il y a des choses qui se passent en BC aussi pour changer d'une quelconque façon le système éducatif? Je ne sais pas si ici au lycée, on apprend encore le fait que l'Amérique a été découverte par Christophe Colomb, parce que si c'est ça, je pense qu'il y a un gros problème avec tout ce qui est réconciliation, mais aussi le fait de faire connaître la culture autochtone, parce que c'est quand même une histoire, puis c'est... Rien que voir ça fait quoi, des années, puis des siècles, puis c'est des siècles d'histoire qui a été modifiée. Puis même dans le monde environnemental, dans des articles environnementaux, des fois, on a encore ce discours de néolibéralisme qui revient tout le temps, parce qu'on place le fait que l'Amérique était comme un genre de terre vierge, où on a cultivé, on a fait beaucoup d'industries, puis maintenant c'est détruit, mais on prend en considération le fait que c'est pas une terre vierge, mais il y avait les Premières Nations avant la découverte.
These are some very important questions, and you're definitely not the first person to ask them. And they're still important questions to ask. The more people we have asking those questions, the more change that we can make. And that's kind of, I guess, if you wanted to give like a thesis to the talk, that's kind of what I wanted to get people to think about. And the way you framed what you were saying, you say these things are taught to us, these are narratives, and narratives are written, which means they can be unwritten. Part of that, and there's lots of stuff written on how like settler colonialism as a like structure and like, you know, active colonizing force and recolonizing force keeps itself invisible, is history. The way we talk about history, colonialism ended. I think Stephen Harper, like back in like 2010, said like Canada like doesn't have colonialism, or is like a post-colonial state or something like that, when it very much still is. And I think educators have a huge role to play, because a very huge part of settler colonial oppression and colonial and imperial oppression on other places in the world is education. I mean, if you look at residential schools, that was to quite literally like educate to assimilate, because quite literally physically murdering us looked bad in Britain's view. It was a PR campaign. I'm not even joking. Look at 19th century Canadian politics. It is fascinating. But it's a matter of actively pushing to change those narratives. But it goes back to that idea too, where a lot of people think, okay, it's on me as an individual. I think to some extent in the world that we live in, individuals can need to be brave and to make that change. But we also have to make those changes at the curriculum level, at the policy level. In New Brunswick, we have, you know, Premier Higgs saying things like, well, we can't say that the territory is unceded because that puts illegal, but things like that, right? We actively have to take people who have power to make that policy change, or power in numbers to push for that policy change, to push for curriculum change. And I think it starts by the simple task of understanding that the stories we tell ourselves about the world are always manufactured. There is no such thing as objectivity. And that is something I actually learned in a colonial institution, learning a colonial style of history. And I think it is on those of us who say have more power or more energy, because we're not dealing with things like racism or anti-indigeneity or homophobia or transphobia or poverty. It's those of us who have more energy to start those conversations, to like listen and to do and to make mistakes. So many people are scared of being viewed as a racist or viewed as environmentally unfriendly that they don't do anything at all. And like, those are people who are putting their own ego before like a world that could literally be better for them and other people. And so I think you're already getting at the answer to some of the questions that you're asking when you say like, these are the narratives that we're still being taught. Well, you're already recognizing it as a narrative. There's another story that we can tell. And the more we tell that story, and the more we let those stories influence the way we continue to think about the world. Well, why do we tell these stories? Who gets to make decisions about what stories are told? Are teachers still telling these stories because they're exhausted and don't have the energy to review their own curriculum, so they're giving the same lessons they gave the year before because they need to do that in order to survive? What can we do to make all of those pieces fall into place so that those new stories can be told, so that we can see that there is a different world? And that's where that systemic thing comes into play. Individuals can absolutely make change, but it's a bigger thing than just changing the lesson in the classroom. Because if a kid shows up to school hungry, they're not going to remember what was taught anyway.
Incredible.
Thanks.
OK, nous avons 1 minute de reste avant qu'on quitte cette salle, et on peut prendre une petite pause juste pour collecter toutes nos pensées. Après ça, je vous invite de vous joindre à une salle de un espace de bravoure. In English, that would be the brave spaces that Jaclyn gave us an introduction to earlier on. Ces espaces, je vous encourage de... je vois que Mercedes fait quelque chose avec la main. Qu'est-ce que tu aimerais dire?
Yeah, sorry, there was folks in the chat just asking, and just to save time, I've dropped my email. I'm also still a grad student, so it may take me a while to get back to you, but I'll do it.
Parfait. OK, merci beaucoup, Mercedes. Tu as nous laissé avec tellement beaucoup de réfléchir, de juste continuer de penser et parler avec nos pairs pour probablement le restant de nos vies. Et sinon, au moins le restant de la conférence. Donc, c'est le temps de quitter cette salle. C'est très important de prendre une petite pause de 10 minutes pour nous donner la chance de regarder quelque chose autre que l'ordinateur. Et encore, je vous invite de joindre un de les 5 espaces de bravoure dans 10 minutes. Merci beaucoup, beaucoup tout le monde de participer et merci 1000 fois Mercedes pour partager toutes ces connaissances.
Thank you for having me. Pagsipi walalio.